The sun dipped low over the jagged horizon, casting long shadows across the barren plains. Dust swirled in the dry wind, whipping against the weathered fences of a lone ranch that had stood too long against time and neglect. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and scorched earth. A single rider moved slowly across the land, his coat torn, boots caked with the dust of 1,000 miles. His face was a map of loss, lines carved by grief, eyes hardened by solitude. He had lived here for years, though lived was a generous term. The rancher had abandoned the town, the laughter, the life that once pulsed through his veins. He spoke little to no one, and when he did, it was clipped, careful, a guard against the world that had taken everything from him. The wind sang through the empty barn, its timbers creaking like the whispered memories of a life that could have been. Evening descended, and the coyotes began their haunting chorus. The rancher's gaze swept the horizon, searching, measuring, always alert. There was a rhythm to his days: tend the herd, repair the fence, draw water from the dry well, and sit by the fire long into the night. But tonight something shifted, a ripple of movement far beyond the edges of his land. Shapes on horseback, shadows riding against the dying light. The rancher's hand instinctively went to the grip of the revolver at his hip. His pulse quickened. Strangers rarely came this far, and yet these figures rode with purpose, steady, patient. 10 of them. Apache. Memories, sharp and uninvited, stabbed at his mind. He had seen the world betray him in countless forms. Fires that devoured homes, friends who had turned into foes, letters that spoke only of loss. He had buried his family in his heart and built walls around himself thick enough to stop even the gentlest kindness. And now, these 10 riders approached, eyes wary but hopeful, carrying nothing but what they could hold and a need he could feel even from afar. The rancher dismounted, boots crunching on the parched soil. The air between them was tense, charged. The Apache leaders made no grand gestures, no proclamations. They simply stopped, letting the wind and the silence speak. One of the riders, a boy no older than 10, clutched a small bundle to his chest, his gaze flitting nervously between the rancher and the empty plains beyond. Hours passed like this, stillness stretching, the land holding its breath. The rancher studied them, worn clothes, faces etched with stories, eyes that held a mixture of fear, hope, and exhaustion. He could see the cuts on their hands, the dust in their hair, the hunger in their eyes. And somewhere, deep within the walls he had built around his heart, something stirred, a recognition of shared solitude, a mirror of his own brokenness. Night fell, and the first stars pierced the indigo sky. The rancher moved first, crossing the stretch of dirt that separated them. He led them to the barn, where the air smelled of hay and old leather. He made no promises. He offered no smiles. He simply opened a space, a fragile gesture that could either heal or shatter. They accepted without words. One by one, they dismounted, shaking off the dust, brushing past the silent sentinel who had chosen to witness their arrival. They stacked what little belongings they carried and shared the warmth of the fire he built, flames licking at the cold night, illuminating faces that had weathered storms both literal and invisible. The rancher moved among them, distributing blankets and water, offering the simple necessities of survival. He did not speak much, but each gesture held weight, a careful choreography of caution and humanity. The youngest Apache, emboldened by the firelight, pressed closer, their small hand brushing against his coat. A flicker of something, perhaps remembrance, perhaps hope, crossed his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. Outside, the wind howled through the broken fence posts. The stars moved slowly across the sky, indifferent and eternal. Inside the barn, the crackling fire held them in a fragile orbit of warmth, a temporary reprieve from the loneliness that had defined his existence. Memories came unbidden. He saw his family again in the flames, faces blurred, voices lost, laughter extinguished. He remembered the night the world had turned on him, when the town burned and promises failed, when he had been forced to leave everything behind. And yet, in the quiet presence of these 10 strangers, He felt something that had been missing for years. Connection. Tentative. Fragile. Unspoken. Morning arrived not with fanfare, but with the soft, relentless light of the sun spilling over the plains. The Apache began to help with chores, tending to the herd, mending fences and clearing paths. They moved silently, efficiently, a rhythm that spoke of resilience and survival learned from the land itself. The rancher watched them, his mind shifting in ways it hadn't in years. He saw a trust beginning to form in small, almost imperceptible gestures, a shared glance, a hand offered, a nod of understanding. And though he did not say the words, though he did not soften fully, something had shifted. The solitude that had defined him, that had been his shield, now felt porous. These strangers, these 10 Apache souls, had arrived not just seeking shelter, but bringing with them a spark, an ember in the vast darkness he had carried alone by the time the sun reached its zenith. The ranch was alive with motion. The herd grazing cautiously, the Apache moving with quiet purpose. The rancher standing on the porch, hands on his hips, eyes scanning the horizon. He felt a tremor of anticipation, a flicker of the life he thought had been extinguished forever. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. He did not know if the world would betray them again, or if the bond forming in the firelight would survive the harsh realities beyond his fence. But in this moment, he was no longer entirely alone. And that, in itself, was a beginning, a fragile, unsteady, and utterly human beginning. The wind carried their voices across the plains, soft murmurs of planning, of laughter, of the quiet acknowledgement that even in the most desolate corners of the world, life could return, reshaped and new. And as he watched the shadows stretch and the sun climb higher, the rancher allowed himself the tiniest, almost imperceptible sigh. Perhaps survival was not enough. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was room once more for hope. The morning sun barely touched the horizon when the wind shifted again, colder this time, carrying a tang of rain and something metallic that made Eli's stomach knot. The plains were no longer quiet. The world seemed to hum with expectation, each ridge a shadow of danger. Clara moved beside him now, her presence commanding without a word. She had already assessed the land with sharp eyes, her gaze noting every sagging fence, every unstable plank, every hollow that could hide predators or men with ill intentions. Eli watched her carefully, the way she moved with confidence, hands sure, shoulders square against the wind. He felt small beside her, but there was a quiet comfort in her steadiness, a tether he hadn't realized he needed. The storm broke by noon. Thunder rolled across the valley, heavy and low, shaking the earth beneath their boots. Rain fell in sharp sheets, drenching the cabin, soaking the hay in the barn, and turning the dirt paths to mud that sucked at their heels. Eli struggled to hold the reins as the horse balked, hooves sliding in the slick soil. Clara leaned close, gripping the saddle horn, her weight steadying the animal, her voice a single calm command. He had never heard her speak more than a few clipped words, but they carried authority and trust. He realized then that she had survived more than he could imagine, and that survival was something one learned in silence as much as in action. The river at the edge of the property had risen overnight, a swollen ribbon of dark water rushing toward the fields. Cattle huddled in the lowlands, ears flicking nervously, eyes wide. Eli's heart thumped as he surveyed the damage, knowing they could lose everything if the waters reached the barn. He worked feverishly, securing gates and tying down the most vulnerable animals, while Clara moved with precision, lifting, pulling, and bracing with a strength he could hardly comprehend. He wanted to speak, to tell her she didn't need to do so much, but words felt inadequate beside her silent competence at BY mid-afternoon. The rain had softened, leaving a mist that hung low over the plains, curling around fence posts and drifting through the barn like ghosts. Eli wiped the sweat and rain from his brow, leaning heavily against the doorframe. His body ached in ways that reminded him of youth and of the harsh lessons of the land. Clara crouched beside a calf, her hands moving with a gentleness that contrasted with her imposing frame, and he realized the dichotomy of her nature, strength tempered with tenderness, power restrained by awareness. He found himself watching her hands, the way they shifted effortlessly between firm and soft, and he felt a strange stirring of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Evening came with a crimson sky, streaked with storm clouds that promised more turbulence. Eli stacked wood for the fire, his movements methodical, almost meditative, yet the tension never fully left him. Clara stood nearby, arms crossed, surveying the horizon. A shadow moved in the distance, a figure approaching across the ridge. Eli froze, heart hammering, and Clara's hand brushed against his arm, not in reassurance, not in comfort, but in a silent signal to prepare. They were not alone. The figure emerged fully only when the last light fell, a man with a rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes narrowed in calculation. Eli tensed, instincts coiled tight, and Clara moved before him, her height and presence forming an unspoken barrier between them and the stranger. The man stopped a few paces away, hands raised in a gesture of truce, but his eyes held suspicion, and Eli knew instantly that this encounter could go sideways. The standoff stretched long, the silence broken only by the distant call of a hawk and the whisper of wind through the grass. Eli's hands were clenched, the knife at his belt a comforting weight. Clara's gaze never wavered, her body relaxed but ready, a quiet promise that she would act with precision if the need arose. The man finally lowered his weapon slightly, nodding once, but the tension didn't fully ease. Eli realized that danger was not only outside. The storm could be human as much as natural. That night, the cabin felt smaller than usual, the fire casting flickering shadows that danced along the walls. Eli sat at the table, head in his hands, replaying the day in fragments. The rising river, the sweat and mud, the stranger's unreadable expression. Clara moved around the cabin silently, preparing supper with practiced efficiency, her movements deliberate, careful. He noticed the scars along her forearms as she worked, pale lines against tan skin, remnants of battles he would never fully know. She caught him staring and gave the faintest of smiles, a small acknowledgement that words weren't necessary, that shared experience built a deeper trust than speech ever could. Sleep came in fits that night, punctuated by the roar of the river, the creak of the cabin, the distant cry of a coyote. Eli dreamed of the plains turning to fire, of men in shadows, of his late wife's face blurring into Clara's. He woke to find her already awake, tending the fire, eyes sharp even in the dim light. She handed him a cup of coffee without a word, and he took it with shaking hands, the warmth spreading through him in more than just physical comfort. The next day, the storm's aftermath was revealed in all its devastation. Fences lay broken, hay soaked through, cattle missing. Eli moved through the land methodically, assessing losses, counting animals, repairing what he could. Clara followed, always near, always ready. She lifted heavy beams, coaxed frightened calves, and moved with a quiet efficiency that made him wonder how she had survived the trials of her own life. The morning broke cold and sharp, the plains etched with frost that glimmered like shards of glass in the pale light. Eli moved quietly through the cabin, boots crunching against the frozen earth outside, the scent of smoke and wood smoke mingling with the crisp air. Clara was already awake, tending the fire with a practiced efficiency, her tall frame silhouetted against the glow. He watched her for a moment, heart tight, the awareness of her strength and resilience a constant ache in his chest. She caught his gaze and gave the barest of nods, a silent acknowledgement that they would face what was coming together. The river had swollen further overnight, a dark ribbon of fury threatening to swallow the lower fields. Eli's eyes flicked toward the ridge, where shadows moved in the distance. Men from the neighboring homesteads had come, armed, determined, their intentions clear. He felt a pulse of fear, not for himself, but for the fragile balance of what he and Clara had built. She stepped close, her shoulder brushing his, her presence a steadying force. He swallowed hard and nodded. They would face this storm together. The first shots rang out across the plains just as the sun cleared the horizon. Dust rose with the hoofbeats of men on horseback, rifles glinting in the light. Eli felt the old fear claw at his chest, but Clara's hand on his arm kept him rooted. He drew his own weapon, the weight of it grounding him in a strange, terrible way. They moved like shadows across the barnyard, ducking behind posts, dragging the animals to shelter, the tension coiling tight around every nerve. The fight was sudden, brutal, and close. Mud and blood mixed underfoot as men pressed against the barn, trying to intimidate, to steal, to assert control. Clara intercepted the first intruder, her stature alone forcing him back, but when he lunged, she moved with precision, a swift shove sending him sprawling into the dirt. Eli's breath came in ragged bursts as he followed, striking, blocking, ducking, the adrenaline turning fear into clarity. Every movement was instinct, every heartbeat a drum of survival. A horse stumbled, throwing its rider into the churned mud, a rifle skittering across the ground. Eli grabbed it, the cold metal biting into his palm, and fired once, then ducked as the return shot splintered the post above his head. Clara moved beside him, steady, lethal in her control, her eyes scanning constantly for the next threat. For a moment, time slowed. The world contracted to dust, fire, rain, and the raw pulse of survival. Then came the silence, brief and electric, broken only by heavy breathing and the groan of timber under strain. Eli's chest heaved, hands shaking as he surveyed the scene. Two of the intruders lay unconscious. Another fled into the hills, cursing, while the rest hesitated, unsure. Clara lowered her weapon slowly, eyes meeting his. No words were needed. The bond forged over weeks of fear and labor spoke louder than any conversation. Together, they had survived what had seemed insurmountable. The aftermath left the land scarred, splintered posts, hoof prints in mud, a fence destroyed beyond repair, but also held a quiet triumph. Eli and Clara moved among the animals, checking for injuries, calming the frightened herd. She crouched to soothe the calf, her hand brushing its wet coat, while he repaired the broken sections of fence, hands raw and bloody. There was no celebration, no grand words, only the steady rhythm of survival, of rebuilding, of life insisting itself through pain. As night fell, the sky a dark canvas sprinkled with stars. Eli and Clara sat on the ridge overlooking the plains. The air was still, the remnants of the storm settling like dust in the hollows. He watched her silhouette against the fading light, feeling the weight of what they had endured in the strange, terrifying warmth of trust and companionship. The plains were harsh, unforgiving, but they had endured together. He realized then that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. He remembered the letter she had brought, the photograph tucked among her things, the silent strength she carried through mud, rain, and gunfire. It had not been words, but actions that had forged their bond, and it had changed him. He could not undo the scars of his past, could not erase the losses that had hollowed him, but he could face the future with someone by his side. Clara leaned against him slightly, her warmth a contrast to the cold night air. For the first time in years, Eli felt that he could breathe fully, that the shadow of solitude had lifted just enough to allow life to fill the spaces left empty. In the days that followed, the work was grueling. The fence had to be rebuilt stronger, the riverbanks reinforced, the animals watched and protected. Each task was a test, each moment a reaffirmation of their resolve. Neighbors who had tried to exploit weakness now approached with caution, their aggression tempered by the evidence of what two determined souls could withstand. Eli felt a quiet pride in the small victories, tempered by humility, knowing that the plains would always demand vigilance.